Hi everyone, I'm Miss Brianna and welcome back to KPL's Don't Be Afraid of the Library. And for this installment, we'll be reading a story from R.L. Stein's Nightmare Hour, Time for Terror. So let's just dive right in. And so the story that I've selected is titled Nightmare Inn. So this is the introduction and it's been illustrated by Gary Kelly. Imagine a New England inn, a beautiful old house with endless carpeted halls and dozens of luxurious rooms, a swimming pool, tennis courts, and lush gardens. A nice place to vacation, I thought, but there was something eerie about the place. I was the only guest, the only person in the pool, the only one in the restaurant, and everywhere I went I could feel the eyes of the staff members watching me. In the middle of the night I lay awake in bed, listening to the silence. I sat up when I heard a key turn in the lock. My door creaked open, and I heard a voice whisper, "My room, my room." The door closed again, but I never got to sleep. Who was that? What did he want? The next morning I was still the only guest. That inn gave me the idea for this story. It's about a girl who finds herself all alone in a creepy old inn, except for one other guest she wishes had never appeared. The car bumped up the gravel path to the inn at the top of the rocky hill. Jillian groaned. "This can't be it, Mom. It can't be. Look at this place." Mrs. Warner stopped the car in front of an old sign swaying in the wind. The words "Night Inn" were etched in the wood, but after night someone had scrawled "Mare" in black paint, making the sign read "Nightmare Inn." "It looks like a haunted house in a horror movie," Jillian grumbled. Jillian's mother sighed. "The inn was beautiful once. My family came here every autumn when I was a little girl." She parked the car a few feet from the front doorway. "They didn't tell me the inn needed this much work. I guess that's why it's for sale at such a good price." Jillian stared at the broken shingles, the shutters tilting at all angles, the cracked windows. A gray cat sat on the rotting front porch. The cat gazed at Jillian and let out a hiss. Were she and her mother really going to move here and run this inn? The thought made Jillian shudder. "This place could bring back my nightmares," she whispered, pushing open the car door. "Don't say that," Mrs. Warner scolded sharply. "You haven't had a nightmare in months. You're 14 now, Jilly. You've grown up so much over the past year. You're past those nightmares now." The previous spring, after her father had died, Jillian had had terrifying nightmares. Night after night she had woken up to the sounds of her own screams. When the nightmares had finally stopped, Jillian felt as if she were starting life all over again. Mrs. Warner tightened the scarf draped around her shoulders. "It's always been my dream to come back here, Jillian. For 20 years I've fantasized about owning this place." Her shoes crunched over the gravel walk. "With a lot of hard work, it can be beautiful again." The front door creaked open, and a young woman stepped out. She was tall and slender, with a pretty smiling face. Her black hair was tied back in a short ponytail. She wore a baggy red and black flannel shirt over denim jeans, torn at both knees. "Mrs. Warner," she walked quickly along the cracked concrete of the front walk. "I'm Priscilla. The real estate agent probably told you about me. I'm the caretaker." Caretaker, Jillian thought. She looks a few years older than me. Isn't she really young to be a caretaker? "It's nice to meet you, Priscilla," Mrs. Warner said brightly. "This is my daughter, Jillian." Priscilla shook Jillian's hand. She had a warm, friendly smile. Her brown eyes flashed as they studied Jillian. "You probably think this place is a dump," she said, taking Jillian's canvas bag from her. "Well, you're right. It is." "How did you get to be the caretaker?" Jillian asked. "I mean, why are you here? The place is closed, right?" Priscilla sighed. "Actually, my father was the caretaker here for 35 years. He retired to Florida last year after the inn closed. But the owner lets me live in the cottage in the back, and he pays me a nice salary to watch over the place." Mrs. Warner pulled a suitcase from the back seat of the car. Jillian followed Priscilla to the front door. It's been pretty lonely, Priscilla confessed to Jillian. I'm really glad someone is buying the inn. Jillian tripped over a board that had come loose on the porch. Ow! Watch your step, Priscilla warned. I've been meaning to fix up the front here, but it's just more work than I can handle. She led them inside. Careful, some of these floorboards are loose. Jillian stepped out of the bright sunshine into a dark, dreary hallway. Most of the lights inside the house were burned out. The ragged carpet had big wet spots and smelled of mildew. Are there rats? Jillian asked. Priscilla shook her head. Not too many. She stopped in front of room 17B and shoved a key into the lock. I fixed this room up for you, she said. New curtains and everything. She turned to Jillian. I also hooked up a TV. We don't have cable, but you can get a few stations. Thanks, Jillian replied uncertainly. The room was clean and pretty, but really small. There was only one bed. She and her mom would have to share. Anything you need, I'll be out back, Priscilla said, smiling at Jillian. Maybe we can go into town later. I'll show you around. Jillian thanked her. She watched Priscilla walk down the hall. Then she closed the door and turned to her mother. Look at this place. We have to get out of here, she cried. Mom, this is a bad idea. I mean, really bad. We have to go home. Right now. Calm down, Jilly. Take a deep breath, her mother said. She tested the bed with her hand. The springs creaked. We only have to stay for one night. I'll go into town right now and close the deal. We can leave first thing in the morning. No, Mom, Jillian protested. You never have to see this place again until it's all fixed up, Mrs. Warner promised. She checked her watch. I'm late. They're waiting for me at the real estate office. Mom, you mean you're just going to leave me here? Jilly, there's nothing for you to do in town. Besides, you've got piles of homework, remember? How can I do homework? Jillian asked. There's no desk. Then watch TV. Mrs. Warner grabbed the car keys and hurried out the door. Please, Jillian, I'll be back in a few hours and we'll get some dinner. Why don't you go exploring? There might be some real treasures left in these rooms. Yeah, sure. Jillian rolled her eyes and closed the door to the room. Jillian read her government textbook for a while, but the wooden chair was hard and uncomfortable. She slammed the book shut. I'm so bored, she sighed, climbing into the creaking bed. She settled back and shut her eyes. So bored. This is so not fair. The floorboards groaned under Jillian's shoes as she made her way down long, dimly lit halls. The air felt damp and smelled of stale cigarette smoke. She opened doors and peered into rooms, but most of the lights didn't work, so she couldn't see much. Humming to herself, Jillian turned a corner. She held her breath and listened. What was that sound? Was it the cat padding down the hallway? Jillian listened carefully. She heard the sound again. A fluttering sound? A bat? I think I'll go back to my room, she decided. I've explored enough. But which way was back? She had turned too many corners, wandered down too many long, dark halls with identical doors along both sides. She heard the fluttering sound again, closer this time. A chill tingled the back of her neck. There had always been bats in her nightmares, flying at her, hissing, red eyes glowing, brushing their veiny wings against her face. Jillian turned and began hurrying down the hall. Did I come this way? Did I? She stopped when she heard the cough. Priscilla? Yes, great. She'll lead me back to my room. She heard another cough. Then the creak of floorboards. She spun around. Priscilla? Priscilla? It's me, Jillian Warner. No reply. Then she saw a sliver of light seeping from under the door of a room at the end of the hall. Another chill ran down her back. Priscilla, are you in there? Jillian walked up to the door and pressed her ear against the drywood. Silence. Priscilla, she called out again. A man's voice, deep and sharp. Go away. It's not Priscilla, Jillian realized with a gasp. Go away, please, the man shouted from the other side of the door. Just go away. But, Jillian sputtered, confused. Who are you? What are you doing here? She leaned against the door to hear the man's reply. To her shock, the door flew open. She tumbled into the room. A young man stood hunched over a bed, covering it neatly with a dark blue quilt. Papers and books were stacked on a small desk in the corner. Please go away, he whispered, his red-rimmed eyes gaping wide. Who are you? What are you doing here? Jillian cried again. He seems more frightened than I am, she thought. The man took a step back, stumbling over a leg of the bed. My name. It's James, he replied, clasping his hands together tightly. Please go away. For your own good. Please. Before it's too late. I don't understand, Jillian said, crossing her arms in front of her to stop from shaking. James swept a hand nervously through his greasy, tangled hair. Listen carefully. I'm warning you. Leave this inn before tomorrow night. He looked so frightened, so pitiful that Jillian felt braver. I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me why. James uttered a sharp cry and gestured wildly with both hands. I'll tell you why, he screamed. Tomorrow night is a full moon, and I'm a werewolf. Jillian laughed before she could stop herself. The young man was breathing rapidly now, his chest heaving up and down. I'm trying to save your life, he said. I'm a werewolf. Every month, before the night of the full moon, I leave my family and hide here in this inn. I lock myself in this room, to make sure I don't hurt anyone. Jillian felt her throat tighten. He's serious, she realized. He really believes what he's telling me. I become a raging animal, James said, turning his eyes to the moonlight pouring in through the window. And then I could tear you to bits. I can't help it. Swallowing hard, Jillian stared wide-eyed at him. He let out a long, sad sigh. Then he pushed Jillian to the door. Startled, she jerked away from him. Just go, James said, for your own safety. At 10 o'clock tomorrow night, the moon will be at its peak, and I will change into a roaring beast. I'm leaving, Jillian told him. You don't have to worry. Tomorrow will be long gone by 10. Mom and I are leaving this horrible place first thing in the morning. Good, he said, his red-rimmed eyes burning into hers. Please go. I really don't want to hurt you. She spun away from him and ran, her shoes thudding loudly over the ragged carpet. Breathing hard, she turned a corner and then another, and finally found her room. She burst into the room, slamming the door behind her, and with a frightened cry threw herself onto the bed. You fell asleep early? Mrs. Warner's voice floated into Jillian's mind. Jillian sat up in bed, feeling dazed, not sure where she was. Her mother frowned as she pulled off her gloves. I'm sorry you were bored, Jillian. I'm afraid I have bad news. Blinking herself alert, Jillian raised her head. Huh? Bad news? I couldn't finish the purchase today, Mrs. Warner said with a sigh. Some other people are making bids too, so we can't go home. We have to stay one more night. No, Jillian yelled. We can't stay, I promised. Mrs. Warner sat beside Jillian and took her hand. Jilly, what's wrong? A werewolf, Jillian said. There's a man hiding here, Mom. He says he's a werewolf. I promised him. Mrs. Warner squeezed Jillian's hand lightly. Another nightmare? I'm so sorry, honey. Do you want me to call Dr. Meyer? No, Jillian jumped to her feet. I didn't dream it. He's here. He's dangerous, Mom. We have to go. Right now. Her mother sighed. Your nightmares always seem so real. She stood up and moved to the door. Show me. Come on. Show me the room. Show me where he is hiding. She reached out to Jillian. Jillian pulled back. Then she changed her mind. Okay, I will. Her legs trembled as she led the way through the long, twisting halls. She stopped in front of the door at the end of the hall. I think this is it. I think he's in there. Mrs. Warner stared at Jillian. Then, biting her bottom lip tensely, she stepped up and knocked on the door. No reply. She turned the doorknob and pushed open the door. The room was dark. Mrs. Warner fumbled for a light switch. She clicked on a ceiling light. Holding her breath, Jillian peered into the room. Empty. a bare mattress hanging over the bed frame, one broken dresser drawer on the floor. No one here. No sign that anyone had been in the room. Jillian shut her eyes. She felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. It was a dream, Jillian moaned. It was just a dream. Mrs. Warner squeezed her shoulder tenderly. Dr. Meyer said you might have a nightmare from time to time. Forget it. Push it right out of your mind. Let's go get some dinner. Jillian spent the next morning helping Priscilla hang wallpaper in the front entryway. Then Priscilla drove them into town. They had lunch at a quaint New England chowder house. Then they prowled the shops and antique stores of the little town. On their way back to the inn, Priscilla turned to Jillian. I heard you had a nightmare last night. Jillian shuddered. Sometimes I have bad nightmares, but I really don't want to talk about it. Priscilla nodded. Sorry. Hours later, back in the room, Jillian glanced at the clock radio. Almost 9:30. She gazed out the window. It was dark out now. The pale yellow moon floated low in a purple sky. The full moon. Mom, where are you? Jillian said out loud. Come back. I don't like it here. This place is giving me the creeps. Sighing, she turned on the TV. Nothing but static. She curled up on the bed. The cold moonlight washed over her. She shut her eyes. Were those footsteps? A cough? From out in the hall? Am I having another nightmare? She heard someone running past her door, down the long hall. As if in a trance, she stood up, stepped out of the room, and followed the sound. Around a corner, she found James unlocking one of the room doors. James, what are you doing out here? Jillian called. His eyes were wild. His hair fell in tangles around his face. It's time, he shrieked frantically. It's time. With an animal cry, he reached out and grabbed Jillian roughly by the shoulders. Let me go, she screamed, but he held onto her and shoved her against the wall. It's time. It's time. I warned you. As Jillian struggled to free herself, the muscles in James's face bulged and twisted. His eyes narrowed to slits and pulled back as a long animal's snout formed beneath them. Glistening globs of saliva poured over his thickening black lips. Jillian stared at jagged rows of yellow teeth, at bristly black fur sprouting over James's cheeks and forehead. It's just a dream, Jillian's heart pounded. Just a nightmare. But she couldn't wake herself out of it. The growling werewolf lowered his teeth to her throat. With a cry of terror, Jillian pulled free. She whirled away from him, dazed and dizzy, staggered a few steps, then started to run. Help! She cried out when she saw Priscilla loping quickly toward them down the long hallway. Priscilla! Oh, help! But as Priscilla came into the light, Jillian froze. She saw thick fur sprouting over Priscilla's face and hands, saw Priscilla's lips pulled back in a ferocious snarl, revealing jagged rows of pointed teeth. Two werewolves! Jillian cried out in terror. Priscilla raised fur-covered arms. Animal claws shot out from her padded wolf paws. She leapt at Jillian with a deep-throated roar. Screaming in horror, Jillian staggered back to the wall. She's mine, James roared. Get away. Priscilla opened her frothing wolf jaws in a ferocious growl. No, she's mine. In a rage, Priscilla leapt onto James's chest and knocked him to the floor. As he fell, James raked his claws down Priscilla's cheek, cutting deep into her flesh. Priscilla howled. 4 rivers of bright red blood bubbled up and flowed over the thick, dark fur on her cheeks. Jillian huddled against the wall as the werewolves battled, rolling and rustling over the carpet, punching, jabbing, tearing at each other. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Then she pushed away from the wall and forced her legs to run. The furious wolf growls rang in her ears as she bolted down the hall. Run, Jillian. Don't look back. Just run. Into her room now. She slammed the door hard and turned the lock. The fierce animal growls echoed down the hall. Jillian threw herself onto the bed. Her whole body trembling, she clamped her hands over her ears and shut her eyes. When Jillian opened her eyes, Priscilla was leaning over her. A smile spread over Priscilla's pretty face as Jillian slowly lifted her head. "What?" Jillian muttered, her throat dry, her tongue thick. "Where am I?" Blinking hard, she saw that she was under a blanket, in bed in the room. "I heard you scream," Priscilla said. "I was passing your room and heard you scream, so I looked in." Jillian took a deep breath and tried to clear her head. Priscilla patted her hand. "It must have been a really bad nightmare," she said softly. "Sometimes people have bad dreams when they stay here. Maybe that's why they call this place Nightmare Inn." Jillian heard a cry at the door and saw her mother come bursting in. "Jillian, what's wrong? Why were you screaming?" Priscilla turned and offered Mrs. Warner a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine. Jillian had a nightmare, but she's okay now." Mrs. Warner gasped. "Another nightmare? Oh, Jilly, I'm so sorry." "Don't worry, I'm okay, Mom," Jillian said, sitting up. She sighed. "Just another dumb dream." "Thanks for looking in on her, Priscilla," Mrs. Warner said. "That was really nice of you." "Oh, what's that on your cheek? It looks like a nasty cut." Jillian glanced at Priscilla's face and gasped. Priscilla rubbed her fingers gently along the 4 dark lines down her cheek. "Must have been the cat." She narrowed her eyes at Jillian. "It had to be the cat, right?" And that ends Nightmare Inn. And if you're interested in reading any more stories from this particular book, it is available on Hoopla, so please feel free to go on ahead and check it out. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye!